Record.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. We're going to be discussing Parshas Vayigash. All right. Now, I want to start with a question on the parsha. All right. And but the answer to that question is going to lead us to sort of two very important different ideas. All right. And one of them we'll see from the Ramban, and one of them we'll see from the Maharal. One of them is going to center on what types of miracles. Well, one of them is going to center on miracles. All right. We're gonna discuss the importance of miracles, why miracles are important. And the other idea is going to center on like what the definition of the Torah is, all right? What the Torah finds important to share with us. All right, so we're gonna hopefully we'll see some pretty fundamental ideas. But again, the springboard to explore these ideas is going to be a question in our parsha. All right, the Torah in Vayigash tells the resolution to the story of Yosef and his brothers. And then Yaakov and his family come down, right? Once they realize that Yosef is alive, he's the second in command in Egypt. So they come down to Egypt. So the Torah says that they came down with 70 people, okay? And it counts that the children of Leah, so there were four families, right? There's four wives. The children of Leah's family, the Torah says, are 33, okay? There were 33 people in Leah's family. So Rashi asks a sort of obvious question, which is if you actually count the number of people listed, there's only 32. Okay, so the Torah's math is off, right? It lists 32 people in the family of Leah between her, sons, her daughter, Dinah, her grandchildren. But it lists 32 people, and then it says that there's 33 people. So Rashi quotes from the rabbis, from the Medrash, that one of the people that's being counted is Yocheved, okay, who's the daughter of Levi. So Levi's daughter, Yocheved, is one of the people being counted, but she was born as they entered Egypt. All right, so, you could imagine this must have been a fairly hectic situation, right? They're traveling. There's a large group of people traveling. And actually, basically, as they enter Egypt, Yocheved is born, right? You hear these kind of stories about people that, give birth in the car on the way to the hospital, right? They don't make it to the hospital. So this was one of the first examples of that. Right, Yocheved was, they didn't make it to Egypt before she was born. She was born on the way right as they got into Egypt. Or I guess they made it just into Egypt and then she was born. And the proof is that the Torah says that she was Asher Yolda Levi b'Mitzrayim. She was born in Egypt, but she wasn't pregnant in Egypt. Right, in other words, right, in other words, Yocheved was born, she was in labor in Egypt. Yocheved came out in Egypt, but her mother was never pregnant with her when they were in Egypt. So Yocheved was born when they immediately entered Egypt. So that's why the Torah says that there were 33 people in Leah's family, even though it only lists 32 of them, because Yocheved, who's from Leah's family, because she was Levi's daughter, was born as soon as they entered Egypt. Okay. Now, that's what Rashi quotes. Okay, so that's Rashi's explanation. Now, the Ibn Ezra, all right, who's one of our other great commentators, and we'll talk a little bit about his worldview in a minute, but he asks a question over here. Okay, and his question is like this. The Jews were in Egypt, and before Moshe came to redeem them, the Jews were there for 210 years. Now, Moshe was 80 when he redeemed them. So if Moshe was 80 and his mother Yocheved was born as soon as they entered Egypt, so then that would mean that his mother was 130 when she gave birth to him. Okay, so that's obviously a tremendous miracle, right? 130-year-old woman to give birth to Moshe, so that's a tremendous miracle. And the Torah makes a big deal about the fact that Sarah was 90 when she gave birth to Yitzchak, right? It tells a whole story about the angels come and Sarah laughs, she doesn't believe them, right? It's a whole to-do. So why does the Torah not mention at all this tremendous miracle that Yocheved was not 90, she was 130 when she gave birth to Moshe? Okay, that's the Ibn Ezra's question. So the Ibn Ezra basically makes a dismissive comment about Midrashim at this point, and he says that, you know what, there's all sorts of traditions flying around out there, right? There's all sorts of legends and traditions out there, but we don't have to take every one of them literally. Okay, so and he quotes another. The Gemara says that there were 7 people whose lives spanned the entire course of human history, right? So you're talking about, you know, obviously they have to live hundreds of years, but one of the people it mentions is a guy named Achia Hashiloni, who's a prophet in the period of the kings. Okay, so he's the prophet right before Eliyahu Hanabi's times, and the Gemara says that he also knew Amram. All right, so that means, you know, he must have lived for like 1,000 years or something, right? Because he knew Amram, and then he also knew Eliyahu. So again, says the Ibn Ezra, you know what? We don't have to take every one of these things so literally. Just because they're saying that this guy lived 1,000 years, okay, you know, that might be a tradition, whatever it means. It might be metaphorical, but it doesn't mean we have to take it so literally. Okay, so that's the Ibn Ezra's question on this medrash, that if Yocheved was born when they entered Egypt, so then she would have been 130 when she gave birth. So why doesn't the Torah mention this tremendous miracle? Now, what I want to try to look at right now is I want to look at 3 different perspectives, okay, 3 different worldviews from our major commentators. The first one is the Ibn Ezra. Okay, so we're going to start with trying to understand. Again, we're gonna answer this question on a technical level, but I also want to understand on a philosophical level what these commentators think. Okay, so we're going to start with the Ibn Ezra's worldview, and we're going to try to understand what he thinks. Then we're going to look at the Ramban. Okay, and like I said, he's gonna have a major insight into the concept of miracles. And then we're going to look at the Maharal, and he's going to have a major insight into the nature of the Torah. Okay, so we have a lot of good information over here. So let's start with the Ibn Ezra. Okay, the Ibn Ezra here reiterates something which he says throughout his commentary. Okay, and I think this is a useful thing to review, because I think for a lot of people this is really, you know, this makes sense to them. The Ibn Ezra says that even though the rabbis record all sorts of traditions which are fantastical, right? They're miraculous. They're interesting. They're above. They're extraordinary, right? They're unnatural. They're above nature. But the Ibn Ezra says we don't need to take every one of them literally. Okay, and we also don't need to interpret the Torah every time based on how the rabbis are interpreting it, because we can sometimes say that the rabbis are maybe recording a tradition. Maybe it's metaphorical, right? Whatever it is, but we don't need to take all of this literally. And we don't need to, and again, we don't need to push it into the meaning of the Torah. So we can read the Torah independently of some of the traditions that the rabbis have, right? Again, not to minimize the rabbis' learning or their insight, but we can understand the Torah on its own level, right? What we call a pashut pshat, a simple, like a plain sense reading of the words, and we don't always need to add in the midrashim. Okay, now the reason I mention this, and I think. Hopefully people are aware that we do have great commentators who see the world this way. And I think it's important because there are a lot of people out there, you know, nowadays who are bothered by some of the inconsistencies and the sort of lack of scientific, lack of science in some of the rabbis' traditions. And, you know, there's large schools of thought now that try to read the Tanakh in a more literal, like plain sense way, without relying on the midrashim. And again, whether you agree or disagree, right, those people are following in the view of the Ibn Ezra on some level. All right, so that's how the Ibn Ezra puts it here, that we don't need to take every one of these traditions about these people living super old and giving birth at a super old age. We don't need to take them all literally. That's his question on the rabbis, right? Why didn't the Torah make any mention of this great miracle? Now let's go to the second major perspective that I want to look at tonight. Okay, the Ramban answers this question. Okay, and the Ramban makes, I would say, 3 major points against the Ibn Ezra. Okay, the more traditional commentators, I'll call them, and the Ibn Ezra is a very traditional commentator, so that's not the right word exactly, but let's call them the more conservative commentators maybe, all right, who are the Ramban and the Maharal. And they're very aware of the Ibn Ezra's worldview, and they respond. All right, they're not happy with it, they don't agree with it, and so they respond, right? Which is their right. Everyone has the right to see things the way they see it. All right, so the Ramban responds to the Ibn Ezra, and he makes three major points. All right, so I want to go through his points, and the middle point is a very important philosophical point. Okay, the Ramban, first of all, he says, you know what, Ibn Ezra is asking a question on the Medrash, but it's not actually a question on the Medrash, because we know the Torah itself says that Yocheved was Levi's daughter. So forget about whether she was born when they entered Egypt or a couple years later. We know without question that Yocheved was the daughter of Levi, okay? And we also know that Levi was 43 when they came to Egypt. So let's do the math ourselves. Forget about the Medrash. Forget about the rabbi's tradition. Either Levi had Yocheved right away, shortly after they came to Egypt, in which case, somehow, right? Again, Moshe was 80 when they left. So either, let's say she was 120, right? Let's say she was 110. I mean, she wasn't a young woman, that's for sure, right? She wasn't in her 30s or 40s. I mean, she was definitely a very, very elderly woman when she gave birth, right? Let's even say that maybe Levi waited. The Ramban says, let's say he waited 57 years. Okay, the reason he says that is because that adds up to 100, right? So if he was 43 when they came to Egypt, and then let's say he waited 57 years to give birth to his daughter Yocheved. So now we have a double miracle, right? Because not only is Levi now 100 years old when he gave birth, right? Which the Torah makes a big deal about Abraham being 100, right? So Levi is 100. But still, right, if you have, what is it, 180, I'm sorry, now I can't do the math exactly, right? If it was 57 years plus 80, right? So that would be 137. So that would mean that you still have to get to 210, right? So what would that mean? She's 73, right? So now you're telling me that Levi gave birth at 100 and she gave birth at 73. So that's like a double miracle, right? In other words, forget about the rabbi's tradition. Either way, you somehow have to span 210 years, right? Moshe is 80 years old. So you somehow have to span 130 years between Levi and his daughter, and Levi is already 43 at the beginning of this. Okay, so either way, there's a massive miracle over here. Okay, so that's point number one. The Ibn Ezra is asking his question on Rashi, but it's not really a question on Rashi. It's really a question on the Torah itself, right? How do we make sense of the fact that Yocheved was so old when she gave birth, and the Torah makes no mention of it? Okay, so now I want to say what the Ramban says. This is a very, very important idea, and this has to do with the nature of miracles. Okay, and the Ramban was a commentator who I guess he was very obsessed with miracles. I actually feel some connection with him about this because I also always like studying about miracles. But the Ramban is always bringing up miracles throughout his commentary. All right, and he always tries to understand what's the point of miracles. You know, what's the like religious significance of a miracle? Okay, so here he's trying to understand that. And he wants the basic way he frames it is, why are there some miracles that are mentioned in the Torah and there are some that are not? Right? Let's follow the view of Rashi that Yocheved was 130 when she gave birth. So why does the Torah make a big deal about Sarah being 90 and it doesn't mention anything about Yocheved being 130? Right? Why are some miracles mentioned in the Torah and some are not? So the Ramban says something very important. He says that there are two types of miracles. Okay, one is a miracle where God tells people what's about to happen, right? So either a prophet or an angel, they show up in town and they say, listen, everybody, we're going to have some big miracle happen, later on. That's one type of miracle. The other type of miracle is that there's some righteous person who's in a bind, right? They're stuck. And God says, you know what? I want to help this person. And boom, he changes the laws of nature in order to help them. Okay, so those are the two types of miracles, right? A miracle means that God steps in, he intervenes in the working of the world in the natural order. He intervenes, he changes the natural order so that something happens miraculous. But the Ramban says that there's two ways that could happen. Either God tells us in advance what's going to happen through an angel or a prophet, or he just in the moment does it in order to help someone out. Now, what's the difference between these two types of miracles? So we can already see, right? One of them is a way of indicating, like strengthening our faith, right? It's a way of showing us that God runs the world. that nature is nothing other than God telling the world how to run a certain way. And if he wants to, he can change it. The other type of miracle is what you would just call utilitarian, right? In other words, let's say there's a righteous person, right? And they I don't know, they drive off a cliff, right? And God decides, I'm going to help them, right? I'm going to bring their car back onto the road. So that's just utilitarian. There's no philosophical value to that miracle. It's just a utilitarian, practical miracle in order to help someone out. Okay. Says the Ramban, the Torah only records philosophical miracles because the point is to show us that God runs the world. But the Torah doesn't record utilitarian miracles because the Torah is not a miracle book. All right. The Torah is not going to record every single event that happens. So that's why when Sarah gave birth at 90 years old, that was a miracle that was predicted in advance, right? The angels come and they tell Abraham that she's going to give birth. So that's why the Torah records it, because it has real theological significance for us. But Yocheved giving birth at 130 was not predicted. It was just in order to help Yocheved, right? She wanted to have a child, so he wanted to help her. But since it wasn't predicted, so it's just utilitarian, so that's why the Torah doesn't mention it. Okay? So that's the Ramban's like first step in this idea. Now, then he adds, and this is one of his, I think this is one of his most beautiful ideas. And he mentions it here. He himself points out that he mentions this idea very often, not often, frequently throughout his commentary. And the Ramban says that we misunderstand if we think that a miracle means the changing of the natural order. Because says the Ramban, really everything is a miracle. The fact that the world operates, the fact that the sun rises, the fact that that we're able to drink food and water, and it goes through our bodies, right? And we can process it and we can live. The fact that a woman can give birth, the fact that people are able to wake up in the morning and have energy, right? Every single thing is a miracle around us. And says the Ramban, when people pray, right, they daven and they're answered. That's a miracle. We're surrounded by miracles. So the idea that the Torah is going to record, let's say, right, the idea that the Torah should tell us when a 130-year-old woman gives birth, but not when a regular woman, a 30-year-old woman gives birth, is wrong, because those are both miraculous events. So says the Ramban, the Torah doesn't need to record every single unusual thing that happens. We understand that God created this unbelievably beautiful world and we get to enjoy it. And that's all a miracle. What the Torah records is only the miracles that have theological meaning because they were predicted in advance. All right, so I think this is like a very beautiful analysis. I think there's a lot of philosophically very important ideas here. All right, basically, I would say it's like a two-step process, right? That first of all, the miracles in the Torah are intended for a specific purpose. They're intended to strengthen our faith and to help us understand that God runs the world. But we should never mistake, this is part two, we should never mistake that those are the only miracles that happen in the world, because really everything that happens, even the natural order, is a miracle. All right, we should use those open miracles to see the hand of God throughout our lives and everything that happens, right? And this is really, I think it's a very true idea. I mean, I'll give you, the classic example is, right, someone's driving down the road and they almost get hit by a car, right? And they're so relieved that they didn't get into an accident, right? So that's a hidden miracle, but it's a miracle, right? So often things go badly the other way. So, it's a miracle every time, something goes our way, every time, we're healthy, we're happy. We're surrounded by the hand of God taking care of us. And that's why the Torah doesn't need to keep mentioning it. I would say it even more strongly, right? If the Torah mentioned that Yocheved gave birth at 130, it would indicate that was a miracle, but regular childbirth is not, which would be the wrong message. That's not the right message. All right. So that's the Ramban's analysis over here. And he just throws in one more thing, which is similar to the point he made before, also a technical point. He says that if you do the math, from the time of David's great-grandfather, okay, so there were 4 generations. Those 4 generations, from the time they came to Israel until David was born, spanned 370 years. So again, obviously people are giving birth at very elderly years, right? They obviously must have been on average about 90 years old when they were giving birth, right? And the Gemara says that Rus, who was the great grandmother, who's the great grandmother of David, she lived to see Shlomo, which is her great grandson. So again, right, you see that the time spans of these people's lives are very long, and they're living long times. They're giving birth at very old ages, and the Torah doesn't make a big deal about it. The Navi doesn't make a big deal about it. So again, this proves his point that there are other righteous people who gave birth at an older age that the Navi doesn't make a big to do out of. And the reason it did so by Sarah is because of the significance of that miracle for us learning about the world. Okay. Now, let me just briefly go to the final point, the third point that the Ramban makes, just because it's a very interesting point. And then I want to go to the Maharal, who has another perspective. Okay, so let me just make this point that the Ramban makes. He says something very interesting. Okay, and I'm not totally sure what to make of this. I'm sure OBGYNs or fertility doctors would have a field day with this. But the Ramban basically says that this is, I would call, almost a second answer to the Ibn Ezra's question, right? Again, the question is, why doesn't the Torah make a big deal that Yocheved gave birth at 130? So the Ramban says, right, we just saw his first answer, which is the more philosophically important one. But then the Ramban says another idea. He says that it wasn't such a big miracle that Yocheved gave birth at 130. Okay, now how does he possibly get to that idea that a woman 130 years old giving birth is not a miracle? So he says the following. He says that the miracle of Abraham giving birth at 100 and Sarah giving birth at 90, but no, I'm sorry, not Sarah. The miracle of Abraham giving birth at 100 was not such a big miracle, because the Ramban says that being considered elderly, being considered old, means, like medically, means that a person's lived 2/3 of their life. Okay, so the first 2/3 of your life, you cannot be considered elderly. So Abraham lived 175 years. That means when he was 100, he wasn't considered elderly, because it wasn't after 2/3 of his life. And then the Ramban says even more, that in his day, when the average lifespan, he says, was 70, he says that people are not considered elderly until they're 60. The doctors don't consider them elderly until they're 60. Right. And I think there's like some merit to this, because, nowadays also people are not considered elderly. I don't know, I don't know what the medical definition of it is, but it's certainly much older than 60. So you see that obviously this changes over time. It's not something that's rigid, but it sort of depends on the medical science of the day. Says the Ramban that furthermore, not only did Abraham give birth to Yitzchak, but he then had other children afterwards, right? He had the Bnei Keturah. He had a bunch of children. So obviously this wasn't a huge miracle that Abraham gave birth at 100, right? And also he says that people in his day give birth very old, right? There's, even nowadays, I think sometimes men might give birth, men might impregnate a woman when they're very old. And the Ramban says that even women who are older, sometimes I guess still menstruating, give birth. I don't know. The Ramban makes a lot of, I would say, medical assertions, which I don't know how medically sound they are. But either way, the Ramban says that it's not a miracle for an old person to give birth. Okay, so why does the Torah make a big deal about Abraham and Sarah giving birth? So the Ramban says it's because of something else. It's because they never gave birth when they were younger. Okay, in other words, when they were young, in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, right? All those years they were trying to have kids, and there was an infertility issue. And now when they're in their old age, now they give birth. So that's a miracle. But if someone gives birth when they're 20 and 30, and then they also give birth when they're 60 or 70, that's not a big deal. All right. So that's the Ramban's view. Again, I'm just saying this because I think it's very interesting. I think it's certainly a very valid point that the miracle with Abraham and Sarah may not have been how old they were, but the fact that they hadn't given birth all the years of their lives until they were in their older years. So that is how he understands it. But again, the Ramban says that it's not a big deal for an older person to give birth. That happens all the time. And that's why it's not a big deal that Yocheved gave birth at 130. Okay. So that's the Ramban's view. Now let me end with the Maharal. Okay. The Maharal, and the Maharal is really the commentator to quote in this regard, because the Maharal's whole world view was opposed to the Ibn Ezra. Okay. So I told you before, the Ibn Ezra had a scientific view of the world. And he basically says that when the rabbis say all these traditions that are like a little, that sound like a little out there, So we don't need to take them all literally, all right? Some of them could be a metaphor, whatever it is. The Maharal is the total opposite of this view. Okay, I would almost, in my head, I almost think of them as like a modern Orthodox yeshivish divide a little bit. You know, the Ibn Ezra's maybe modern Orthodox, and the Maharal's maybe yeshivish. I don't know if that's exactly the way to describe them, but it is that sort of divide. All right, you know, how literally do we take all these traditions in the Gemara? Sorry. Okay, so the Maharal's like whole life is his whole life work, and he wrote a lot of books. But his whole like view is against the Ibn Ezra, that we can never say that something the rabbis say doesn't make sense, because the way he looks at this, everything the rabbis say has like layers of meaning, and their level of insight is far beyond anything we could ever imagine. So if it doesn't make sense, it's only because we see the world in a skewed way. We see the world on the surface, but we don't understand the layers of meaning and the depth of meaning in the world that the rabbis were able to see. So the things the rabbis say that sound like they're from left field is because the rabbis are describing like the essence of the world, and we're not able to discern that. So the Maharal's whole method is to explain the layers of meaning and the depth of meaning behind everything that the rabbis say, in order to, you know, to help us see the meaning, the depth of what they're saying. So what does the Maharal say over here? Says the Maharal, there's no way to say, like the Ibn Ezra is saying, that the rabbis are making up a miracle that Yocheved was 130 years old when she gave birth, which didn't actually happen historically. It definitely happened. So now we're back to our question. Why doesn't the Torah mention it? Right? If the Torah makes a big deal that Sarah gave birth at 90, so why doesn't it mention that Yocheved gave birth at 130? So the Maharal has a phenomenal line. I think this is a beautiful line. The Maharal says that the Ibn Ezra is misunderstanding the point of the Torah. He thinks that the Torah is like a record of interesting things that have happened, right? It's like it's a history book with some interesting stories in it. Says the Maharal, the Torah is not a collection of interesting little anecdotes. It's not about novelty, items, like out of the ordinary little. It's not like a fairy tale with all sorts of little miracles happening. The Torah tells us the essential foundation of the world. It tells us what the essence of the world is. That's the point of the Torah. It's not about what miracles happened. So that's why it doesn't mention the miracle of Yocheved giving birth at 130 years old, because, yeah, you know what? That's really interesting. And maybe that's why it hints at it. And it's really nice to know that. And that's why the rabbis recorded it. But the Torah does not tell us things just because they're interesting. The Torah only tells us things which are absolutely vital and foundational to the whole universe. And the stories of Abraham and Sarah and the patriarchs and the matriarchs, the avos and the imahos, those stories are foundational because that's the foundations of the Jewish people. So anything that happened to those people, to the avos and the imahos, anything that happened to them, it's not a private story that happened to someone individually, but it's a story of how the whole world was created. Because the Jewish people are right. That's a story of how the Jewish people came into being. So it's a communal story. It's a story that's relevant to every one of our lives because that energy, the force that we know of as the Jewish people, was created by these people. So that's why the Torah tells us the story of Sarah giving birth at 90, because it's not a private story about Sarah giving birth. It's not a nice little thing that happened to her. It's a story about how the Jewish people came into being, how the Jewish people were created. And that's a foundational story that describes the way of the world. So that's why the Torah tells it to us. But the story of Yocheved giving birth, she's not one of our matriarchs. So even though it was a very important birth, she gave birth to Moshe, but it's not foundational in the same way. And therefore the Torah doesn't tell it to us, even though it's interesting. All right, so those are the three major worldviews that I wanted to discuss. Again, the question we've been discussing is, according to the rabbi's tradition, why does the Torah mention the miracle of Sarah giving birth at 90, but it omits the miracle of Yocheved giving birth at 130? And now we've looked at three perspectives over here. All right, one is the Ibn Ezra, that the traditions of the rabbis need not be taken literally, all of them. All right, and that's his view. We can interpret the Torah in a plain sense meaning without some of the midrashim. We've looked at the view of the Ramban, that the Torah is not a collection of miracles. It's not a miracle book, right? The Torah it teaches us theological lessons, and where a miracle helps with that, so it's relevant. But if a miracle is just there for, just to, if the point of the miracle is just to tell us a little story, so then that we don't need, because again, that would send the wrong message that those are miracles, but daily life is not a miracle. And the truth is that everything that happens to us, really, most of the things that we encounter in the world are a beautiful miracle. All right, so that's the Ramban's view. And then we've seen the Maharal's view that the Torah is not a history book. It's not a book. It's not a collection of little anecdotes, interesting little, historical tidbits, but it's the description of the foundation of the world, how the world came into being and what the essence of the world is. And in that sense, the stories of Avram and Sarah are foundational in a way that the story of Yocheved is not. All right, so, okay, let me stop this.